All right. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here for our sample psychology classroom in the College of Arts and Sciences at Syracuse University. My name is Rachel Skipper. I'm our Associate Director of Undergraduate and Graduate Recruitment, but I'm really just kind of emceeing this session. I'm really not the reason to be here. So to kick things off, I will introduce to you all the real star of the show, who today is Professor Joyce, who I know you're all eager to meet. She started teaching at Syracuse in 2019, so she's been here with us for 5 years now. And she's a professor in the Department of Psychology, which is, again, in the College of Arts and Sciences. Her classrooms are open to, of course, psychology majors, but also to those of you in the room who might have an interest in psychology and not be majoring. So regardless of who you are, I think you could see Professor Joyce in class one day. Professor Joyce studies how people might change the way they recall the past to feel good about themselves or to maintain self-esteem. And I know that buzzword of self-esteem is maybe why some of you, like me, are really interested to hear her lecture today. She also teaches classes at Syracuse which focus on broader aspects of psychology, like general social psychology, and also research methods and statistics. I want to mention too that Professor Joyce has mentored a lot of students through their research process. So she's someone that you might all want to talk to once you're here at Syracuse if you're interested in research, which we hope many of you are, as that's a big focus for us in the College of Arts and Sciences, including for our undergrads. All that to say, you're in good hands with Professor Joyce as your instructor today. And with that, I'll leave it to her to lead today's class.
Hi, good evening. I yeah, time flew by since I joined campus here at SU. I am local to the area, grew up here, so it kind of felt like coming home, which was a very welcome feeling. And tonight I am hoping to talk to you about this little pocket of what would fall under the branch of social psychology. So, social psychology is what I got my PhD in. It is the area within our department that I'm affiliated with. I'm happy to talk more broadly about our different areas and courses that we offer. Typically, social psychology is going to be one of our required foundational courses for the major. So if you became a psych major, I'd probably see you in there. But it's also a class that is widely attended across campus. Like there's a couple other majors that required it as well, because social psychologists study such a wide variety of topics. We look at everything from some introspective stuff about the self to our relationships, which can be both romantic relationships, friendships, working in group settings like group projects that you might have to do. We look at stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, broadly about different attitudes and behavior, with the connection between all of these topics just being a focus on how knowing that other people exist and might be paying attention to you impacts the types of choices you make with your opinions and your behaviors. So, with that in mind, that's kind of the perspective that I take when I'm thinking about self esteem, when I'm trying to figure out where does it come from, what does it mean. So, tonight, that's like I said, the little tiny pocket within this bigger field that I want to focus on with you. I've got some slides that I'm going to share, and we can get started. All right, let's see. Is that still showing the big display? Looks good. Okay, awesome. So I called this talk that we're going to work through together Self-Esteem, who has it and how do I get it? So that we could start thinking about kind of the differences in both what contributes to self-esteem and how that might be related to who the person is. But before we start thinking about that, we probably want to know what is self esteem. I've got this definition here that it's an evaluation of oneself. But you probably have your own definitions of self esteem because this has become the type of psychological concept that a lot of people are familiar with. So either if you want to unmute quick or share in the chat, I'm curious to hear, how would you explain what is self-esteem? I'm looking for access to my chat. My screen's got hidden. There we go. It's popped up now. All right, chat is open. So, what do we think? What is self-esteem? Do any of us have a guess? Yeah, the type of confidence that you have. I think that's a good way to think about it. Knowing what you can do well. Yeah. So sometimes you might have heard that term self-confidence. And I think in our day-to-day lives, we use that in a way that's really similar to the term self-esteem. It's when we use that term self-esteem in research, a little bit, maybe slightly different than confidence, because it's not just about your belief in your skill sets, but it's about looking at your whole of a person. So your skills, but also other broad personality traits, maybe the way you look or you think or you feel or you sound, and coming to a conclusion about whether that's something you are happy with. So you have probably heard self-esteem described as being either high or low. Self-esteem comes in different levels. When we think of high self-esteem, we are talking about a positive evaluation. You're looking at that question of who am I and thinking it's somebody that I like. If you've got low self-esteem, you might be thinking, I am not proud of the person I'm seeing in the mirror for whatever various reason, something related to your skills, your personality, something's not meeting the bar for you. When we discuss this dynamic of having different levels of self-esteem, high or low, typically what we might not realize we're describing is our global self-esteem. Global self-esteem is treated almost like a personality trait in research. And that means that we make this assumption that it's kind of stable. So across different situations, different environments, different points in time, everybody typically carries with them a certain level of self-esteem. You might know some people who have a really positive evaluation of themselves, and you might refer to them as having high self-esteem. You might have some people who are lacking in that self-confidence, not liking what they see in the mirror, who have low self-esteem. And generally speaking, if that's true today, it's going to be true tomorrow. We stay pretty constant in that global self-esteem level. But you probably have noticed that there are certain things that can happen in your day-to-day experience that make you feel a shift in your evaluation of yourself. You get a failing grade on an exam, or your romantic partner breaks up with you, you're going to be feeling bad. So even if typically you have a high level of self-esteem, something happens to make it momentarily jump down. We refer to that type of self-esteem that's happening as a reaction as your state self-esteem. So today, when we talk about kind of differences in self-esteem, what might contribute to self-esteem being high and low, we're going to have conversations about both this global self-esteem that is longer lasting and a little bit more consistent, but also this state self-esteem that's really reactive to the moment and the situation. So I want you to be thinking about that state self-esteem. What are some situations? I gave you kind of two examples, but what are some situations that seem to impact your own self-esteem? When do you see it getting a boost or a decrease? Go ahead and if you want to share those out loud or in the chat, we can hear them that way again. So, um, getting bad grades, questions right or wrong, maybe some competitions like sports. Yeah. Changes in your relationships, feeling like you don't understand something in class. We've got some ideas. If somebody else gives you a compliment or an insult, right? That's either going to give you that boost or that drop. How your energy level's feeling that day. Yeah. Okay. Um, when you feel like you can accomplish something, you feel boosted. If you are procrastinating, that's a time you've noticed that you're feeling down. Our body image might have an impact on our self esteem. Awesome. Okay, so we've got some ideas. What I want to do is take a minute to use some research to help us think of some other examples. So on this screen, you can scan the QR code and it's going to bring you to a survey. Or if that's not working for you, we can use the link. Rachel just popped it into the chat for you. So feel free to use that direct link or scan the QR. And this is going to give you 35 questions about yourself. Nobody's going to see your answers. So totally anonymous. Feel free to answer as honestly as possible. When you finish those 35 questions, it's going to give you a screen that shows you some scores. So make sure you hold on to that screen. Don't click off of it because we're going to have a conversation about the scores when you're finished. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes to work on those questions. Feel like I should have prepped some like elevator music for the background while we're doing this part. When you reach the end and you've got your scores, go ahead and give us a thumbs up through the reactions. All right, awesome. I'm seeing a lot of the thumbs going up. There might be a few of you who are still working, which is perfectly fine. Um, but let's start looking at what we just worked on. Now, uh, first, is there anybody, show me with reactions, maybe who these questions sounded familiar? Has anybody done this one before? Looks like a no. Has anybody taken a measure of their self-esteem before? Okay, maybe just one or two of us. And when you're thinking about self-esteem, whether you've taken a measure, a test of it before or not, do you feel like you've got an idea about whether you would describe yours as high or low? Yeah. Yeah. So now I'm seeing some more thumbs popping back up. When we think about self-esteem, especially with kind of our own working definitions, we usually have a pretty good understanding of whether we would consider it high or low. Even if describing it that way is new to us, we've got a pretty good guess about whether it's positive or negative. This survey that I had you take is a little bit different from trying to figure out, is it high or is it low? The survey that you just completed is called a measure of your contingent self-worth. So contingent, that word means kind of tied to, attached, dependent on. So now we're thinking about different aspects of your daily life that might have a really big impact on your level of self-esteem. What are the things that seem to make it increase or decrease the most? What things matter to you? And what we find in research is that different people care about different stuff, which shouldn't be that surprising. But as a whole, there are a couple themes that seem to stand out and be the most common. So when researchers look at contingent self-worth, they over time have identified kind of seven different categories. Here, this is information about how your scores were calculated. So you'll see that each score had five questions that contributed to that category. And some of them have some different scoring things happening. But when we look at the different questions, if you open up that link, it'll let you go back and view the questions again. You'll start to see the themes. You might have even started to notice them as you were answering the questions, like, oh, I think I know what this one's getting at. So the first one that we have, family support, is all about asking whether you feel like your family believes in you, approves of you, is supportive of the choices that you're making for your future. And what we find is that a person who has family support as one of their contingencies is somebody who, when they feel like they are receiving a lot of positive support, is going to have really high self esteem. But if they don't have their family's approval, they're going to have really low self esteem. So that's what their self esteem depends on. That's when it's going to start jumping around. And that's true for all of our categories. That's kind of what we mean by contingent. So, competition is that idea that some of you mentioned, like sports, when you are competing against another person and you're able to see this really clear evaluation of kind of who's winning, who's losing, who's performing the best. Sometimes that matters to people. Appearance will matter. We mentioned things like our body image. This category that the researchers have called God's love isn't necessarily referring to any one specific kind of higher power or religious belief, but it does have that component of people would only have this contingent self-worth if they believe in some kind of religion or higher power. And if they do, the idea is that if you feel like you're living and conducting your life in a way that's going to conform to your religion's belief systems, and get you approval in the eyes of your higher power, whoever you might refer to as God, then those things would contribute to a higher level of self-esteem. Academic competence is all about how are you performing in school. And we talked about that, right? When you get bad grades, that's when you've got your lower level of self-esteem. Virtue is going to be similar in some ways to God's love, in that it's kind of taking stock of how you're living your life and trying to figure out, is this something that I'm proud of based on value systems, belief systems? But virtue is unique from God's love because it doesn't have that religious component or any belief in a higher power. It's about your day to day kind of moral behavior. So, based on whatever code you use to figure out morality and good behavior, that's where virtue comes in. And then approval from others is thinking about outside of your family. So, your peers, your friend groups, are they saying and doing things that make you feel accepted, like you are receiving their affection? And if so, then that's where the impact would be coming from. So I like to do this contingent self-worth scale with my students because it gets us thinking not only about, is my self-esteem high or low, which we usually have this kind of good guess about coming into it. But maybe we start noticing some things about ourselves. Like, where are we being motivated by? What are the things that really seem to have an impact on how much I like myself on a day to day basis? And it's important to maybe pause and think about the fact that these 7 different categories exist because not everybody is going to be motivated or impacted by the same stuff. For some of you, family support really matters. It's one of your contingencies, but some of others of you, that's not on your list. So it doesn't really matter how your family is viewing your decisions. You're comfortable blazing your own path, and that's not a source of self-esteem for you. When we think about these different sources of self esteem, what we see is that people your age, high school, college, often have really contingent self worth. So that means that when you're trying to figure out, who am I? Do I like that person? These domains seem to really matter. You have reactive self esteem. You're looking to kind of try and figure it out. Do I like myself? I'm not sure. So you try to figure out, how am I performing in school? How do I feel about my appearance? Am I receiving approval from other people? If you're interested specifically in this aspect of contingent self-worth and the larger conversation of self-esteem, the person who created this measure and does this line of work is Jennifer Crocker. She's a faculty at Ohio State, so I've included a link here where you can get some more readings and information about contingent self-worth. But the thing that I think is really important for this discussion is that when we're thinking about contingent self worth, it's not just that these are the things that can make us feel bad, but they're the things that make us feel good and bad. They're the things that give us any kind of reaction. So here I've got 2 different figures, and you can tell this is kind of coming from some old school research because I copied them in from a physical textbook instead of having any kind of electronic version of them. But what you're seeing here is that we've got this sort of measure of how the person is feeling, their level of self esteem. And this is going over several days. So each little triangle is a different day. And then you'll notice that there's some days that are labeled with rejection or acceptance. This person here does not have an academic contingent self-worth. That's not one of the domains that matter to them. So we can see when they were applying for different graduate programs, they get a rejection, it doesn't feel great. They get an acceptance, it feels good. But generally speaking, they have a really consistent level of self esteem. It's not being impacted by this, it's staying at that global level. If we compare that to somebody who is high in their academic contingent self-worth, now we see a lot of movement in their level of self-esteem. Something happened that had them feeling good, and then they got a rejection and it dropped them down low, stayed low for a little while, got an acceptance, boosted them back up even higher than they started. They were feeling good for a little while, got another rejection. So we're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of jumping around. And I think this is important to point out because now you have, from your scores, some ideas about where you might be experiencing some contingent self worth. And if you're seeing high scores compared to the other categories or domains, you know that that number, that higher value, is telling you this is one that seems to impact your self esteem. So, this is an area that if something goes wrong, it's going to hurt big. But it also means that this is an area, if it's going right, you are going to use that as a source of self esteem. So here, this person who doesn't really respond, they're not receiving any of those boosts from success in their academics either. It isn't a way for them to feel better. Whereas when you have that contingent self worth, it's both. It's a vulnerability, it's a weakness, but it's also one of the places that you can use to give yourself that boost if you need to feel better. So if you've got a high academic contingent self-worth, then you know finding projects that you can succeed in, courses that you're going to be excited about, professors that you're eager to have as mentors, that's a place that you're going to get that self-esteem boost from. When we look at self-esteem, what we find is that it tends to become more stable over time. So I said that people your age typically have contingencies in their self-worth. Does seem like your self-esteem is reactive. It does have some of those jumps. When we look at people who have older ages, they're living later stages of life, typically they're experiencing more stability. So we're not seeing those fluctuations anymore. They've got that global self esteem and they're just kind of stuck in that pattern where they are. What we find is that sometimes self esteem stability can actually help us, if we're thinking in a clinical sense, understand different outcomes like depression better than just your level of self esteem. When you have heard conversations about low self esteem before, which you probably have, you know that it's something people are motivated to avoid. Having low self esteem is this risk for putting us into this negative mindset, having this poor self concept, which can lead us to things like depression at a clinical level. But what we find is that people who have low self esteem typically do have a higher risk of depression. But what might actually be explaining part of that is that low self esteem tends to be less stable. A person who has that globally lower level of self esteem is going to have a more reactive state self-esteem. There's going to be more jumping. So if they have a contingent self-worth, that domain's really going to have a big impact. They don't have a lot of consistency or stability in how they're feeling about themselves. And that lack of stability, the jumping around, is going to be our best predictor of who might have experiences with things like depression. So I think this is important to know because a lot of the conversations around self-esteem focus on trying to figure out how do we get high self-esteem? How do we feel good about ourselves? But what we really want to identify is how do I feel good about myself in a way that's maybe not dependent on any one specific area of my life. I'm not going to put all of my eggs in the basket of academics or appearance. I need to kind of diversify that portfolio, get sources of self esteem a little bit from everywhere so that I'm not feeling really contingent or dependent on those jumps because that's when I'm going to see that lack of stability. When we talk about self esteem, we've got this difference now that we've discussed in global and state levels of self esteem. We know that self esteem can be high and low. We know now that it can be reactive or contingent on our different domains. Another area of research on self esteem focuses on whether it's what we would call explicit or implicit. Your explicit self esteem is your conscious evaluation of yourself. So, what I mean by that is it is how you feel about yourself in a way that you are aware of. If I asked you, what is your self esteem? Is it high or low? Some of you gave us the thumbs up saying that that's a question you would be able to answer. You've got an idea about your valuation. When you were reflecting on that, you are paying attention to your explicit self esteem, the one that comes to mind that you're able to deliberate, think about. And so when we're interested in those types of self esteem, we're going to measure it by just asking you to reflect on yourself. Self report, give us your thoughts on is your self esteem high or low? This means that it can be subject to some bias. You might be lying on the questions to give me a certain impression of yourself. If you want me to think you're confident, you're going to answer in a different way than you might be actually feeling. But also, when we say that it's subject to bias, we mean that this could be something where you have sort of fooled or tricked yourself into believing it. So you think you're answering in a way that's honest, but it might not truly accurately reflect all of the complex feelings that you're experiencing. And part of the reason that can happen is because we also have this other concept, implicit self esteem. Implicit self esteem is our unconscious evaluations of ourselves. So, this is these kind of automatic feelings that we have towards ourselves that we're not consciously aware of. We don't know. If I ask you about your self esteem, you're going to give me information about your explicit self esteem because that's the one you're capable of thinking about. Implicit self esteem lives deep inside us. It impacts our feelings without us being able to think about it, be aware of it. So you might be wondering, well, then how do we study it? As researchers, we've developed a bunch of different tasks. One of them, the name letter task, is really simple. What we find is that your average person is going to prefer their initials more than other letters of the alphabet. So you might see people wearing jewelry that has their initials on it. They might doodle their name. You often use your name and your initials more than other letters of the alphabet. You're drawn to them. And that is because they're connected to your idea of yourself. And if you have this positive evaluation of yourself, you like things that remind you of who you are. So people who have a low implicit self-esteem, a more negative concept of themselves, are going to perform differently on that name letter test. They're not going to show the usual pattern of preferring their initials. Or another way that we measure this is the implicit association test, or IAT. Has anybody heard of the IAT before? See if we've got any hands going up for this one. This one might be new. So when we look at the IAT, typically people are going to complete it on a computer. It might appear a little bit different than what we're seeing on the screen here. I've got what would almost be like a Scantron type of approach to it. But basically what's going to happen is you're going to have some words that belong to the category me, some words that belong to the category not me. You'll get some practice identifying which group they're supposed to belong to. You'll do something similar with words that belong to pleasant or unpleasant, good, bad, something evaluative like that. And then the sort of trick to the test is that you are going to have all of the words shown at the same time. So now you're either going to be marking on the left side of your paper if the word fits with unpleasant or if it fits with not me. And then you're going to do the same thing, but with them switched. And what we measure is how quickly people are answering these questions. You're going to be faster when they're paired together in a way that matches your implicit self-esteem or your automatic patterns, associations. So if you have a positive self-concept, you're going to be faster when pleasant and me shared the same side. And you're going to be slower when unpleasant and me share the same side. But if you have low self-esteem, the opposite would be true. So we've got these kind of tricks like that that we can use to measure your implicit self-esteem, since it's not something we can just ask you about directly, because you don't actually think about it. You don't know that unconscious component. And what we see is that sometimes explicit and implicit self-esteem match. You feel good about yourself outwardly and inwardly, but sometimes there is a disconnect. And so one specific pattern where this can happen is when a person has high explicit self-esteem. So if you ask them, do you like themselves? Do you like yourself? They're going to say, of course I do. I'm awesome. But at that unconscious level, something deep inside of them is lurking, telling them, no, I don't actually like who I am. They've got low implicit self-esteem. What we find is that this pattern tends to make people into kind of choosing defensive choices. They often are very reactive to feedback. So they're going to have that very unstable self-esteem where it's jumping around and it's really contingent. They are going to spend a lot of time thinking about situations where they might receive negative feedback or any kind of type of rejection. And they are often going to hold really strong attitudes. So, what this can mean is that they feel a really strong sense of conviction that their way is right, they're correct, they've got things figured out. They're going to overestimate how much other people agree with them. They're going to think that everybody should be on the same page. And then when they discover that no, other people might have different ways of thinking, they will be really sensitive to that and feel like they're being rejected, criticized, and they're going to receive really big jumps in their self-esteem as a result. So both this explicit and implicit self-esteem can vary on whether they're high and low. And depending on how they kind of combine to make a pattern, we might see things like this specific type of self-esteem, defensive self-esteem, which makes people more susceptible to those contingencies. when we look at various different patterns of self-esteem, we've got defensive self-esteem. We also see a bunch of other types of self-esteem patterns coming up when we look at the combinations between uh, our explicit and implicit self-esteem. And what we find is that they impact what's happening in schools, in peer groups. So remember, I told you that I study self-esteem from the perspective of a social psychologist. I'm interested in how the social situation, interacting with other people, impacts self-esteem. So I'm interested in the way that approval from others impacts your self-esteem, but also how does having high or low self-esteem make you treat people differently? What we find is that people with this kind of defensive self-esteem that we just discussed are often going to receive kind of high ratings from their peers. Their peers assume that they have a lot of self confidence, and they often are people who typically end up being bullies in school situations. But we've got other patterns here. So, what we see sometimes is that people have what we might describe as a humble self esteem, where they feel positively about themselves, but other people don't notice that. So they're not displaying their high self esteem in a way that seems like bragging or overconfidence. They're kind of keeping it quiet. This is often more common in boys. And what we see is that girls who have humble self esteem are more likely to be targeted for bullying. So they might be the ones that are being victimized in those situations. We see where humble self esteem is more common in boys, that self belittlers are more common in girls. This would be that you view yourself as having a negative self concept, but your peers around you aren't realizing that because they're assuming that you have positive qualities that you're noticing, right? They see the good in you. So they're giving you high ratings when they're thinking about what your self-esteem probably is. And then we've got also just generally low self-esteem, where you and your peers are noticing that about yourself. These are people who are often on the receiving end of some bullying. And our last pattern that sometimes we see is called secure self-esteem. This would be a person who has high self ratings and peer ratings, but they don't have defensive self esteem. So, this is somebody whose self esteem is high both explicitly and implicitly. And these are the people who often in school situations are acting as defenders. They're the ones who might confront a bully, stand up for somebody who's being picked on, um, and part of the reason they're capable of doing that is because their self esteem is not going to be as contingent on approval from others. So they feel comfortable intervening in those types of situations. When we look at this, I pointed out to you that there are some gender differences in the way people experience self esteem. What we see is that generally speaking, men tend to score higher when their self esteem is being measured, which might make it sound like men have more self confidence, more positive views of themselves than women. Often, when researchers are viewing the fact that women have lower levels of self-esteem based on measurement, we see this as kind of degrading yourself, which could be an outcome of some internalized sexism, might be something you're doing intentionally to kind of come off as humble, not conceited, we don't want to brag based on some of the ways that women have been socialized to be pleasant and nice to be around. But we also notice that there tends to be just some differences in the way that they answer surveys in general. Men tend to be more comfortable using strongly agree and strongly disagree when they're taking any kind of survey, which could contribute to why they have higher scores at the end on things like self-esteem measures. And then the last thing that I want to share with you about self-esteem, because I know we're getting close to our time, is that we've looked at gender differences. There's also some differences in cultures. People will tell you that average levels of self-esteem are lower in Eastern cultures. A lot of this research uses participants and comparing levels of self-esteem in the United States versus Japan. And Japan tends to produce lower levels of self-esteem, making us think they have a more negative self-concept. But that's not true. It doesn't really make sense. Why would they not like themselves as much? What we find is that measuring self-esteem, studying it as a science, is really based on thinking about how do we define what it means to have a positive self-concept. And so over time, a lot of our measures of self-esteem, the questionnaires that you'll answer, focus on values that are really tied to Western nations. So they're going to ask about things like your competence, your individuality, um, pride in kind of leading the pack, where those aren't the types of things that people develop self-confidence from. Those aren't impacting their contingencies when Eastern cultures like Japan or China. Instead, in those types of cultures that we might call collectivistic, people are going to value more about contributions to groups and family. It's less about success and more about your agreeableness, kindness, personality traits in that way. And so, what we also find is that just like women, collectivistic cultures are less likely to choose those endpoints, strongly agree, strongly disagree. So, they often end up having lower scores. So I've got a lot of things that I just kind of spilled out on the table for you about self-esteem. We're thinking about how it's impacted by our culture and our gender, and how, when we're thinking about what does it mean to have self-esteem impacted, it could be in a specific area. If we've got contingent self-worth, we could contribute to different types of profiles where we're looking at, is it high explicitly? Is it high implicitly? How do those combine based on our peers and how they see us? So, what I want to do now is use our last couple minutes together to hear any of your thoughts about this conversation on self esteem. Let me know where you've got some questions. You can pop those into the Q&A. Um, what do you think? Yeah, feel free to shout it out, turn your mic on if you've got questions. So what are some ways to improve self-esteem is one of our questions. And I think there's maybe two ways to answer that question. If you're looking at how do we boost it up in the moment to feel good, it's going to be tied to some of those things that we identified as areas of contingent self worth. So, if we're trying to make ourselves feel good in the moment and boost up our positivity, then getting compliments from our friends, support from our family, and we might have things that we've learned over time get us that kind of feedback. We know if our friends really like our sense of humor, telling jokes might be a way to cheer ourselves up and make us feel better because they're going to laugh, they're going to give us that approval in that way. But if we're thinking more broadly, how do I get my self-esteem to be more stable? How do I get it to be more positive as a whole? Then we're looking more at that global self-esteem instead of the more reactive state self-esteem. What we find is that typically that's something that comes a little bit with age. It's going to become less reactive. We do see increases in self-esteem over time, but really at the core there, it's about just your own evaluation of how you're doing. So what we want to do is detach it from any of those contingencies. Feeling like when I'm evaluating myself, I'm not going to pay specific attention to my grades or how much my friends are laughing at my jokes, but I'm going to pay maybe more attention to, do I like the way my life is going? Do I like the way that I'm contributing to life? Um, and that way we might create that more stable type of improvement in self esteem. Next question is, can a person have more than one self-esteem? And yeah, that's kind of what we looked at tonight, right? So they can have a high self-esteem in the context of it being explicit, but they might have a low self-esteem in the context of it being implicit. They don't always have to match. And if they match versus if they don't match is going to create different dynamics in the way that they connect with their friends and feel about themselves. A person might be high in a couple different areas of contingencies. So all of them might have showed up as high scores for you. All of them might impact you, or none of them. It really can be any mix of any of those contingencies. All, none, some. I think we've got a question in the chat too. I've noticed that your friends feel I'm confident, but maybe you're not feeling like you personally are confident, even though that's how your friends view yourself. That would be really similar to that kind of humble self esteem type of person. And here, often what that means is that your friends are noticing uh, that you are kind of succeeding in the different areas that they use to as criteria, right? You're getting good grades, you seem likable according to other people, uh, meet conventional standards for appearance, whatever criteria they're using. And so the key there is really all about um, trying to see what they're seeing, right? What we find is that one of the ways we develop self-concept is, and that just means our identity, how we learn who we are, is through looking at what are our friends saying about us? What do other people do? How do they treat me? And so part of that can be just incorporating and accepting those friends' viewpoints. It sounds silly, but the fake it till you make it advice, kind of faking that you believe them until you actually believe them, seems to actually work. Trying to view yourself from your friend's perspective instead of your own is a way to experience some of that switch. Can societal expectations and stereotypes impact self-esteem? Totally. Yes, absolutely. They are going to impact the ways that we feel like we have capabilities. Um, what some research shows is that people who are on sort of the receiving end of negative stereotypes and prejudice, so they're in some kind of marginalized identity, often they're going to be aware of that stigma, and that is going to mean that they feel limited in the choices that they have because they know despite their own ambitions, they might not have success in all areas of life because people are going to discriminate against them. That's going to really impact how capable they feel, um, how well received they feel, that's gonna matter for self-esteem. One of the other questions was, do you teach a class like this on campus? Sort of, I do. Um, One of my favorite classes to teach is called Self and Identity. So we don't only look at self-esteem, but we look at a bunch of things related to the self. So we're going to look at how do we figure out what our identity is, what kind of things impact how identity develops and changes over time, including some questions about how stereotyping and discrimination fit into that discovery. Um, and that's definitely one of my favorites to teach. Can you change which self-esteem affects you the most, and does it change naturally over time? Yeah, it does. What we find is that typically people who are in school, high school, college, are going to be the most likely to care about academic competence, which is unsurprising. But also, just more generally, any of those metrics that have to do with evaluating success based on some kind of benchmark criteria. So you're also going to have more contingents in that kind of competition. Um, and so it's all about, am I succeeding based on these objective standards, right? Am I getting the highest grades? Am I winning the most competitions? And then as you get older and improve over or grow over time, age over time, what we see is a shift from valuing that to really switching and becoming more concerned about your relationships. So when we look at those kind of relationships, we're thinking more about the support from family, approval from friends, and we see those becoming what is more of an impactor on your self-esteem because that's what you tend to value more at an older age.
All right, everybody. Thank you for all those great questions. It looks like we are close to time. And if you have further questions for Professor Joyce, you're always welcome to email those to me and I can pass those along for you. I can also send questions that you might have to current students who are enrolled in our psychology program. If you have questions for the students about what it's like to really take classes like this in person on our campus. I know there's a question about kind of classes being taught. So I'm excited that some of you are thinking ahead about what this might be like for you. And I'm happy to help you find answers to this question. So you've all received emails from me in the past, and I apologize, probably a lot of emails from me in the past. So you have my contact information, and you're welcome to reach out to me when you have questions in the future. Professor Joyce, thank you so much for being here to talk to this group of students. I've had fun also learning from you in the background today. We really appreciate you being here. If you have any closing remarks for the students, I'll let you plug those in now, and otherwise I will leave you all to have a good evening.
Oh, I just want everyone to know that this is our last week of classes. So it's a really busy one in terms of my inbox. But after this week, if you want to send me an email to talk about any of the concepts we covered tonight, or more generally, the psychology department at Syracuse, I love having those kind of conversations. So uh, if I'm slow this week, don't take offense. But after that, I'll be happy to chat.
Thank you for the disclaimer. I'll try not to be in that bucket with you, but it is a crazy time of year for all of us. So students, you're always welcome to reach out to me in the meantime if you need a quick answer. You are my full-time job, so I will do my best. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. I'll leave you with the big Go Orange, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you again, Professor Joyce.
Have a great night.